All right, we will start, and others can join us whenever they get here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Ada Umenwaliri, and I am the Associate Director of the African Studies Center here at UNC Chapel Hill. Thank you all for joining us. Welcome to the second of our 3 series on reimagining electoral democracy in Africa. Today's talk, we will focus on the elections process in Africa specifically. Our third and last talk will focus on civic engagement and will take place next Thursday on the 21st at noon, exactly a week from today. If you missed our first talk on democratic resilience, check out the recording on our YouTube channel, UNC Africa. Today's session is also being recorded and will be uploaded to the same channel. Meantime, if you have any questions during the webinar, use the Q&A box and we will try to get to all of the questions. So our conversation this afternoon dives into the elections process, specifically voter registration and participation, vote collation, the issues of disinformation. We might also touch on illiberal forces and their influences on the outcome of elections and elections in Africa. And we would also touch on the use of technology. And today we have the privilege of being in conversation with 4 experts. So let's get to meet our experts. One of our panelists will still be joining us. Oh, there she is. Cynthia is joining us from Liberia, and I appreciate the efforts. I know it's sometimes logistically challenging when you're traveling. Thanks for being here, Cynthia. So I would introduce all of our panelists back to back, and then we would start the conversation with one question that I've posed to all of them, and they would respond. So our first panelist that I will introduce is Cynthia Mbamalu. She is the co-founder of Yiaga Africa, where she serves as the director of programs. She has 16 years experience promoting and supporting democracy, youth and women's political inclusion, electoral integrity, and human rights. Ms. Mbamalu has participated in and led different election observation missions in Nigeria and beyond. She currently leads the hashtag Watching the Vote project, a data and tech-driven initiative for electoral integrity, and was actively involved in the advocacy that led to the adoption of the Electoral Act 2022 in Nigeria. Cynthia is the founding member of the Not Too Young to Run movement, which achieved the amendment of Nigeria's constitution to reduce the age for contesting elections. Cynthia recently launched the Unamplified podcast, driving diverse conversations on democracy and development in Africa from a gender lens. She's a lawyer by profession and training with an LLM in comparative constitutional law from the Central European University. Welcome, Cynthia. Our second panelist, our second panelist is Dave Peterson. Mr. Peterson is the Senior Director of the African Program of the National Endowment for Democracy. Since 1988, he has been responsible for NED's program to identify and assist hundreds of African non-governmental organizations and activists working for democracy, human rights, free press, justice, and peace. He was formerly the Executive Director of Project South Africa of the A. Philip Randolph Educational Fund and a freelance journalist in Africa and Turkey. He has a bachelor's from Columbia College and a master's from Columbia Graduate School of Journalism in New York, as well as an MA in African Studies and International Economics from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in DC. He has visited more than 40 African countries since 1984 and has published numerous articles on African politics. He's also the author of Africa's Totalitarian Temptation, The Evolution of Autocratic Regimes, published by Lynn Reiner, 2020. Welcome, Dave. That's my alarm. Our third panelist, Bodunrin Adebo, serves as Program Director, Southern and East African Region at the National Democratic Institute in DC. Mr. Adebo oversees political participation, civic engagement, legislative strengthening, and electoral support programs in Ethiopia, Uganda, Mozambique, the African Union, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, and regional programs, including the Youth-Focused Political Party Leadership Institute. He has over 24 years of democracy and development program experience across sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. He led implementation of high-level democratic governance programs in Tanzania, Iraq, Ghana, and Nigeria, which also included policy advisory support to national election commissions, political parties and inter-party platforms, capacity building support to civil society organizations, citizen election observation coalitions in the same countries. Several of these programs have included providing capacity building support to underrepresented and minority interests like women, youth, and persons living with disabilities. Mr. Adebo holds a Master's of Art in International Development, Public Policy and Management from the University of Manchester, and a Master of Public Administration from the Lagos State University in Nigeria. Welcome, Board. It's good to see you. Our board and I used to work together centuries ago. And our last but not the least is Dr. Joseph Siegle. He leads the African Center for Strategic Studies research program that aims at generating policy-relevant analysis that addresses Africa's strategic and security challenges. His research includes the political economy of democratization, the role of governance in advancing security and development, the implications of external forces, including Russia in Africa, stabilizing fragile states and strengthening institutions of democratic accountability. Dr. Siegle has written widely for leading policy journals and newspapers and is a regular media analyst. Dr. Siegle holds a doctorate in international security and economic policy from the University of Maryland's School of Public Policy, and a master's in agricultural economics with an emphasis on African food security from Michigan State University. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for responding to my request. I appreciate your time and your expertise. So the goal of this series is to provide a timely platform for us to have the generative discussion and analysis on democracy in Africa. More for us to interrogate and engage in conversation focused on what is happening to democracy in Africa, especially as we're seeing an increasing number of uprisings and threatening situations that threaten the stability of the continent. So I'll open up this discussion with a question that I'm going to direct to all of you. The question is, what do you see as the most significant challenge that African nations are facing with their elections process? How do you think these challenges impact the overall state of democracy on the continent? And maybe we can take the question just in the order that I introduced you. So we could start with Cynthia, Dave, Board, and then Joe.
Thank you, Ada, and thanks for having me as part of this conversation. And greetings from Monrovia, Liberia. There's an election in Liberia in October. So I'm part of the ECOWAS expert mission here. So I'll be here till the elections, actually. So it's interesting that we're having this conversation because I just got out from a discussion at the ECOWAS radio on democracy in West Africa and what are the prospects. And so if I just reflecting on your question, what is the major challenge? I do believe, just looking at the elections in Nigeria and Sierra Leone and even Kenya, I think the major challenge is confidence in the process, or rather trust in the electoral process. There is a dwindling level of trust, and I would say there's a major mistrust or distrust in the system, both as in the electoral process and in the independence of the Electoral Commission. And for me, this is an important conversation. The issue of trust goes into the soul and the heart of an elections, because if the people, if stakeholders, actually the political parties, if citizens do not trust the process, regardless of the outcome, it would always be contentious. And so when I think about the major challenge, the thought is, how do we begin to rebuild confidence in the process and inspire trust in the process? That is on one hand. And then the second, how do we begin to build the capacities of the elections management bodies in such a way that they also inspire confidence in the voters and in the political actors in the respective countries? And so the issue of trust for me is a major challenge. And if you look at the recent protests in Kenya, if you look at the happenings in Sierra Leone post the elections, if you also follow the conversations in Nigeria, you can see a particular trend of an elections conducted. Yes, there are no perfect system, but there are fundamental questions on the transparency of the process, fundamental questions on the conduct of the elections management body, fundamental questions on the character and nature of the incumbents in those respective countries pre and during the elections, and most importantly, the question around the confidence in the judiciary. So if I just these key institutions of judiciary and the Electoral Commission on the one hand, and then the process, you could see that as long as the process, as long as people do not trust these institutions, regardless of the outcome, they would always be questioned. So that's one point of my reflection. The second part of the reflection is this: for most of our countries in Africa, we have very young democracies, meaning that for a lot of us, our elections are still in the developmental stages. So if you think around Nigeria's elections, barely 24 years of democracy, as at the time we had our elections earlier in the year. If you think about Sierra Leone, that's a country recovering from a civil war. And even in Liberia, the major challenge now, a lot of people are questioning the process and the institutions also. So one of the things is, because of the fact that our democracies are quite young and our elections are still in the very developmental stages, there is also that need to review the engagement on elections, how we engage the electoral process. There is that need to review the investment in building institutions of democracy. So how do we build institutions that can conduct elections in such a way that citizens are confident in the outcome of the process? So the approach to democracy for me, just observing what is going on within the region and the sub-region especially, is the fact that because we're still testing out elections, a lot of us are still trying, we're still in the developmental stage of our electoral process. There are major gaps, and if these gaps are not addressed with successive elections, they remain part of the challenge in the system. And so with every election, citizens' expectation is that one election is better than the previous. But if the elections if successive elections are not an improvement of the previous elections, it raises questions. And the reasons you don't see improvement is because institutions are not properly structured to achieve those kinds of improvement that you'd want to see. And so generally, if you think around what the experience is, the major challenge for me is still the trust issues. And to achieve and address the issue of trust and confidence, we really need to review our engagement with the process, review the support to the Electoral Commission and key institutions of democracy, and to invest a lot more in building a system that does ensure transparency and that can subsequently inspire confidence of the citizens. Thank you.
Thank you. Dave?
Yeah, well, I would have to agree with Cynthia. You know, I think the primary challenge for African elections is the credibility issue, you know, and I think she's really stated very well what that is. You know, I think just to kind of add, though, some additional thoughts there, you know, I think that in the first place, African elections are very expensive. You know, the electoral commissions are very challenged, I think, just to pay for it. And the amount of the state budgets that go to pay for elections is really quite enormous. You know, that in addition to the huge amounts of money that are spent on the campaigns. So, you know, I think it's very important for the electoral commissions to communicate, to assure the voters that they're being transparent. You know, I think the elections that have been relatively more successful, for example, in Ghana, I think benefited from the Electoral Commission, you know, really communicating very effectively and, you know, reassuring the voters that their vote would count. I think, you know, looking at the upcoming elections in DRC too, I know that's not focus of the agenda here, but there's a lot of lessons to be learned there too, where you know, the electoral commissioner himself is a very well-known, competent technocrat, really. You know, he knows a lot about conducting elections, but he's suffering a lot from the opposition's doubts about his neutrality. And, you know, despite everything I think he's tried to do to reassure the opposition political parties, there's still a lot of challenges and doubts that are being sort of fostered that way. You know, Sierra Leone was a bit the same way, where, you know, I think there, the Electoral Commission, at the end of the day, sort of failed. I mean, whatever the actual results were, and I know, you know, there were NDI had some parallel vote counting there that they were conducting, and did find some serious flaws with the Sierra Leone elections. But you know, one of the theories as to why the ruling party cheated on those elections, or why, you know, there was a problem there, was that you know, they didn't want to go to a second round because it was going to be too expensive. You know, I mean, even though you know, President Bio, I think most people agree that he won the majority of the votes. Sierra Leone has a special system where you have to get 55% in order to win in a first round, and you know, the evidence seemed to indicate that he did not get that 55%, but you know, they sort of, somebody fooled with the figures a little bit so that he could get over that level. But like I say, it ruined the credibility of the elections, but it seems that it was very likely, very possibly due to just concerns about how expensive it would be to have a second round. And so the processes, you know, I think sometimes need to be revisited. In the case of Nigeria, you know, I was privileged to observe those on the NDI IRI observer mission, and you know, I think it was very interesting that you know, the Electoral Commission, again, despite its best efforts, in this case, it was the technology, I think, that was really the problem, where a lot of faith was invested in some of the new technology that was used, and in particular the device. Cynthia, you'll have to remind me the name of it, that was being used. But it was exactly right. So it was very effective in terms of getting people through the line, and confirming that they'd been registered properly. And so I initially was very excited. I thought, oh boy, this is going to be a good election, the best election, in fact, that I've seen out of the many that I've observed in Nigeria. But then, as they were sort of collating the results and trying to transmit them to the Electoral Commission, somehow the technology, for some mysterious reason, didn't quite work the way it was supposed to. I mean, they were able to transmit the House of Reps results, they transmitted the Senate results. Then when it came for the presidential results, the machine wouldn't work. And it was not just where I was observing, but I think in many places in the country, those presidential results just didn't get transmitted the way they were supposed to. And I think the Electoral Commission sort of apologized and said, oh, we just are having a problem with our server or whatever, and the technology wasn't working. And that may or may not have been true, but it certainly created a lot of questions for the average voter, and cast a big doubt on the final results. So again, Tudumu may have won free and fair, but there was a lack of credibility. In this case, the technology failed, and I think that's just something that we need to appreciate. It's a credibility issue, but that's coupled with technology and paying for it all.
Thank you, Dave. Bod?
All right, thanks, Ada, and good afternoon and evening to everyone. Yeah, I think my takeoff point also will be to agree very strongly with Cynthia and Dave's submission. Both of them have spoken about the issue of credibility, trust, capacity of election management bodies in Africa. I fully subscribe to that. But I would also like to say that what I've also noticed is the ability of election commissions to consistently build up on successes that they've recorded. I think we all agree that the 2015 elections in Nigeria, though it wasn't a perfect election, but it was a good election. Judging by where the country had come from before then. And that election stands till date as the only election that at least one of did not result in any form of a contestation, judicial or otherwise, after that election. So we should ask ourselves that question: why that? Why couldn't we build on the success of 2015 in 2019, as well as this last election we just had? It's not just peculiar to Nigeria. We've seen that also in other places. We've seen it happen in Kenya after a moment of crisis. Reforms were introduced. There was a good election, and then after that, there seems to have been a relapse, in Kenya. I think Ghana also, which has always been a model of election management on the continent, it wasn't without some concerns, in the last election. So maybe that speaks to the point Cynthia raised earlier, that many of our election, it's a developing democracy. And as such, many of our election management bodies are also grappling with these issues based on several of the factors that has been raised. I would also add that part of the challenge that I've seen is the conduct of the players in the field. Elections are essentially a political affair, but over and over, a political affair is becoming more of a legal affair because we're seeing that there is a rise in the number of post-election petitions. Now, we might, in the case of Nigeria, focus more on the national election. But there are also sub-national elections. I think we have more than 1,000 cases in the tribunals right now, dealing with the National Assembly elections, State Assembly election, governorship elections, and, it goes on and on. And why is that? I think part of that is the nature of the political parties we have and the nature of those who emerge from the platform of those political parties, because our parties are hardly, organized along the lines of ideology. You cannot tell the difference between party A or party B. So support is often built around, ethnic sentiments and things like that. Then the other point I would also add to trends that I've seen in terms of why there is a reversal in elections, in electoral processes on the continent, is the role that the information space, plays in this regard. I think we all agree that there's been an increase, in acts of misinformation as well as disinformation and hate speech. Elections in Africa is not immune to manipulation happening in that space. And what this does also, it erodes trust in whatever comes out of the election at the end of the day. It increases polarization as well, because people believe what they want to believe, and they use what they believe in, to engage in especially in the social media space, whether Facebook, WhatsApp, the ability of traditional media in the past to curate those information, to do their own fact checking. I think that is no longer there. So if you are an election commission that is not up and doing, you are not proactive in terms of how you engage, citizens, how you make sure that information is coming out in real time, that space is going to be left open, and it's susceptible to manipulation by those who have their own agenda, to promote in that regard. Now, looking at how this has impacted, I think, like I said, that it has reduced trust, trust in whatever result that is declared by the Election Commission. It has also, in a way, drawn a lot of cynicism about our judicial system. I said earlier that elections are essentially a political affair, but when elections become a legal affair, it's not going to change the perspective of those who believe that, look, my candidate should have won, and whatever the election law says, is your own legal interpretation. And the overall impact of that is, even though the legal interpretation might be correct, the political perspective matters a lot, because ordinary citizens don't understand the legalese. What they understand is that I've gone to vote, and I believe that in my own area, in my constituency, this person won. So whatever it is you interpret from what the law says, those are technical things. I'm not interested in that. So there's that cynicism and doubt that is gradually creeping in on the judicial system. And I think part of our challenge is how will we ensure that we don't bring institutions like the judiciary, that is very critical in terms of sustaining democratic processes in any country, that people don't lose confidence in the independence and the impartiality of, an institution like that, all because of the game that politicians are playing, to favor themselves one way or the other. So I'll stop here and continue later.
Thank you, Bodunrin. And Joseph, please.
Yeah, thanks, Ada. And it's an honor to be part of the panel here. And important to really take time to reflect on where we're at because of the growing challenges we're seeing with African elections and the backsliding overall of democracy on the continent. I think the biggest problem I would throw out for consideration is the lack of political will at the regional level to uphold electoral standards. And I think this is clearly evident in how we've seen the reaction to the Zimbabwe elections most recently. This election didn't meet even the minimum standards of what a credible election would entail. Opposition wasn't allowed to campaign freely. There was intimidation, control of the media. On election day, there was a limited number of polling sites in electoral areas and urban areas, and then even then, the polls didn't open up on time, or the ballots didn't show up. There was arrest of the election observers. They blocked the parallel vote count process from taking place. There's lack of transparency in the collation, and the reported results were not credible. All the while, similar to what Cynthia noted, the election management body, was seen as not independent. There was nepotism, heavy involvement by ZANU-PF family members and other leaders, and in the conduct of the election management body there. And while SADC and other election management or election observers did condemn the results and the process, there really wasn't any further action taken to not recognize that result and to demand a rerun of the election, as we've seen previously in Malawi and Kenya. And so I think that pattern of a lowering bar for electoral standards, something we've seen, we saw in Gabon before the coup, but in Sierra Leone and prior to that in other elections, I think that lowering the bar is the real challenge, and the unwillingness by regional bodies to uphold the standards to make sure that the elections are more credible. And that has far-reaching implications, because every other incumbent on the continent is watching and seeing that if they can get by with a very low bar, then what's the incentive to try to maintain more credible elections? And I think that's contributing to this disconnect between electoral processes on the continent and the lack of trust among citizens. There was a recent survey that showed even prior to the Nigeria elections that 77% of the voters didn't believe that their vote was going to actually be tabulated fairly. So whether or not that was true, that perception is, I think, at the heart of these issues of trust and confidence that all the other panelists are talking about. And I think when you can't, simply rely on the national authorities to do that, that's where regional actors need to come in and try to maintain those standards.
Thank you, everyone. We all seem to share the same views on what the challenges are. We talked about trust, the weakening role of the regional bodies in enforcing and regulating election outcomes and processes, and just kind of playing a more impactful oversight role. We also talk about the fragility of, public institutions, especially we mentioned the electoral bodies, and we also mentioned the judiciary. and the double-edged sword of technology in advancing electoral processes like registration and vote collation, but then also how it can be manipulated in different ways, and also the very important issue of disinformation and spreading lies and causing violence and all that. And I will go to the next question. And, Bodunrin, you already had mentioned, the role of the judiciary in your first response to my broad opening question. And so let me ask you specifically what your thoughts are on how African nations can ensure the integrity of key democratic institutions, such as electoral commissions and the judiciary, and how they can be empowered to play a strong and impartial role in overseeing and safeguarding the election process, especially in the context where trust in these institutions may be challenged. And we all know that that is the case.
All right, thank you. Well, I think the first thing I will say is that if you're in a relationship and you want to build trust, you have to learn to be vulnerable, right? To share everything about you with your partner. So there is a social contract that we're discussing here between our democratic institutions and the people, because ultimately these institutions are meant to serve the people. And this takes me back to, the first topic we discussed, that how do we decouple the process of appointing, confirming, and accountability of our election management, bodies. So long that we have a sitting president, or even if it's not a sitting president, every president will want to see his party win. Nigeria might be an exception, going by the last election, So that means you have your own interest, as far as that election is concerned. And you are the person who is appointing the chair of the election board, the commissioners in the board, the state resident electoral commissioners, and on and on and on. So that process is not going to help us in building, sustainable electoral democracy in Nigeria as well as in any other country. So I think the first thing is how election commissions can open themselves up more, open the data, open, information, give access, to citizens so that they can see real time, the information you have that you're processing, the challenges that the Election Commission is confronted by. I know Dave made reference to the BIVAS technology, and then, the whole brouhaha around the IREF. Yes, even the mere principle of what the IRF thing was supposed to be, the claim is that, no, it's not a collation website, it's just a viewing portal. That by itself is important, in terms of opening up the mystery around the result tabulation, the result management system. It's not peculiar to just one country. I think we had that also in the last election in Kenya, that while the one but last election, that before results came in from more than 40,000 polling units in the country, results had been declared, and that raised questions. It raised doubts in the minds of people before the Constitutional Court stepped in and a rerun was ordered. So let election commissions embrace this idea of open data, open up your data, let people see it. Protect the data also so that it doesn't get, they don't manipulate it in a way. And then there should be, that effort to strengthen the autonomy and the capacity of EMBs in terms of how they are appointed, in terms of how funding is provided, in terms of how the Election Commission itself, is strengthened. I must concede that we've recorded some gains by way of legal reform, of the electoral law in several countries, but there are still gaps. But I think the basic principle should be that the legal framework should, for any election, should remain true to the fundamental principles that elections are meant to serve the interest of the people, that the election law and the performance of the election management body should be to respect the choices of their client. The voter is a client, that the Election Commission is serving. So at the end of the day, the product I want from my EMB is to see to it that I voted, my vote counts, it was counted, and my vote mattered, at the end of the day. I think in terms of the judicial process, reform is also needed in that space. Reform in terms of the timing of when election petition cases are dispensed with. Some countries do it better than some other countries do. You have presidents who will be in office with a cloud of doubt, as well as questions of legitimacy hanging on the neck of that leader. That shouldn't be the case. We need to find a way. If we have to set up special, election courts, not just tribunals, because we know justices and judges who sit over election issues also have other remits that they must, respond to. So I think we should look into our legal system to reduce the number of bus stops that you have to stop at before election petition cases are dealt with, the capacity for those who are so responsible to, who are so charged with that responsibility to do it, as well as the question of how those judges are selected. Before I round up, I also want to talk about, even with what we have right now, conceding, accepting that, all right, it may take quite a bit of time in many countries for us to see that whole scale change in terms of appointment, nomination and appointment of chairs and members of election boards. What about the integrity of the people, who are so appointed to head those election boards? We've seen what an individual the difference one individual can make in terms of driving reform in an institution as important as an EMB. Let me use the example of the Ethiopia National Election Board of Ethiopia. There's no question that for the last Ethiopia election, everyone respected the person of the chair of the board, Betuka Mideksa. She brought in such a level of integrity. She brought in a level of trust in citizens when her appointment was made. And she knew that responsibility, she carried that responsibility, in terms of how she discharged her function. Whereby you are appointing people into such sensitive position, it should also be that you are appointing people who have the integrity, people who command that respect and who will be able to deliver, what will be acceptable, what will build confidence, in citizens. So the perfect system we have right now needs to be reformed. But while we're on the journey towards that, it's also incumbent on those who have the powers and the responsibility to appoint, not just to appoint anyone who will just come in to do their own wishes, but give people, give us people who have, that status of integrity to do right and to do well. And I think the 2015 election in Nigeria, the former chair of the Ghana Election Commission, Professor Farid Jian, they are all examples of, people of integrity who have superintended, election management boards, and, things have also worked out well in that regard. Over.
Thank you, Bodunrin. Thank you for highlighting the issues at stake here. I consistently heard, the need to reform the judiciary system, and different ways, and in interrogating different ways to legitimize the process of, selecting, and appointing people who serve as judges, essentially reforming the judiciary system, but more critically, what frameworks or mechanisms can be built into the governing process that helps to support a process where integrity integrity is considered in also the selection process. And I'm going to go to our second panelist to ask him a question. But before that, I wanted to also, there was a point you also talked about information board, in building vulnerability and in building trust, and how governments can enforce the social contracts as a way for building trust. And the voter is a client, like you mentioned, but the electorate, people like me, suffer from asymmetry of information. And when there's that lack of knowing, and as a voter, you're working from the blind and disadvantaged, it shows up in different ways. And one of it is, low electoral participation and voter apathy. And I'll go to Dave. My question is, can you share insights into voter apathy in Africa with specific references, and share any best practice strategies or policies that successfully address voter apathy and promote inclusivity, especially during voter registration in African countries?
Thank you, Ada. I think there are several factors that impact on participation. We've discussed quite a bit one important one, which is the credibility of the process. I think if voters feel like it's a credible process, if there's been enough communication from the electoral management bodies and what have you, then I think voters are assured that there's a good chance if they vote that that will count. I think another factor, and of course every country is different. Some countries you see these massive turnouts, in other countries it's very small. But I think that if people feel like there's a real contest going on, they will turn out and vote. I think in the case of Nigeria, we have a good example. In past elections, the turnout has been, sort of mediocre. But in the last elections, I think a lot of voters thought that, there was a real competition that was going on. You had, this sort of young challenger, and relatively young in Obi, and then you had this sort of old guard, and it was kind of exciting, like a football game or something. People were interested in registering their opinion about it. And then I think if you contrast that with a country like Mali, for example, where despite the country's reputation at one point for being, quite a bastion of democracy, the contests, I think, were not always that interesting for the population. It was the turnouts tend to be very low, maybe 20% or so, and my impression is that the voters saw it as sort of a competition between two elites who were not that different from each other. There wasn't that much at stake, and there was a lot of apathy. And I think, as a result of that, too, when the military juntas came along and, took over power, they could do so without a lot of popular protest, because, as far as I think a lot of the population was concerned, this was just a matter of political elites, and they didn't feel like they had a lot at stake. Interesting, I think in the case of Zimbabwe, as bad as those elections were that Joseph was describing, the turnout was pretty high, because I think people really did see a difference between the two candidates, the two main candidates that were contesting, and so they wanted to participate. But finally, I think a third sort of element in participation, and Cynthia, I think, is really a great example of it, is, these sort of citizen mobilization efforts. Yiaga has done great work. I know now that she's in Liberia, she's probably meeting with NAMOT, which has done some great work in terms of getting young people excited about elections and to participate. There are a lot of civic organizations in Africa, I think, that are trying to do this and really contributing, whether it's to try to get women to participate or youth to participate, or persons with disabilities, or just the average voter. I think these citizen efforts really can make a difference. I think in the case of Nigeria recently, they certainly did, but we've seen it in many other situations too. So I think those are the three main drivers of participation that come to my mind: credibility, citizen organizations that are trying to mobilize, and just whether it's an actual competitive contest or not.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks for also summarizing the three key drivers of what you would consider that would encourage citizens to come out and register and also participate in the vote collation process, and actually voting and waiting for the results to be announced. And I like that you also looped in Cynthia into your response, because the next question will be directed to Cynthia. It's the critical role of mobilizing and getting citizens to be part of the process, especially with Africa's growing population amongst the youth. The demographic is highly young. So Cynthia, my question is, how can African nations, in your opinion, better engage and motivate the citizens, especially the young people, to participate in the electoral process? And also, what are some common challenges that are faced during the vote collation process, and how can these be tackled?
Yeah, thanks again, Ada, and it's so I'll just build on Dave's comments or when he was responding to his question. And I think for me, essentially, democracy is about the people. And if we talk about democracy in Africa, with young people making up a larger percentage of the population, you can also see democracy is also about young people within the continent. But participation for me, beyond just the rhetoric, needs to be informed, active, but also there needs to be opportunities for participation to actually be enabled. And so if you think around what African nations can do, I believe the first for me, honestly, is that young people want to be heard. Young people want to have a say in decision-making processes. Young people want the opportunity to be part of the system. And sadly, this is a young continent with very old leadership, in the sense that, yes, it's a continent with a large youth percentage in most of our countries in Africa. For most countries in Africa, youth population is above 50%. You'd have some countries as high as 60% youth population. But yet it's still a continent where a majority of the leaders are still really old, not just at the level of the executive, but also in the parliament or the legislature, depending on what respective systems call it, but also within the political party system. And so if you think around opportunities of engagement, opportunities for youth participation, for a lot of young people, there's almost that dilemma of how do we engage? The system in itself doesn't recognize me as an actor in the political space. And so that first part for me is young people want to be heard. And so for African leaders, for leaders within respective countries in the continent, there must be that intentionality to create spaces for youth political participation. And participation are in different levels. There's the participation as candidates who contest for elections, who represent their constituents in office post-elections. So there's that level of participation. There's also participation through what people call people's assemblies, the citizens' assemblies, where young people can engage their representatives, can engage policymakers, share their opinions, and those issues or those opinions or those conversations inform governmental actions and decisions. So that's another level of participation. And there is a very primary, common, or most the simpler form, which is voting. And for when it comes to voting, is a process in itself designed to enable youth participation as voters, but not just even youth participation, but looking at youth as a heterogeneous group. So you have young women, young persons with disability, young out of school voters. And so if you think around the opportunities for engagement, for participation, there needs to be a lot more intentionality in creating those spaces for young people to engage, either as candidates, as party leaders within their respective political parties, or young people to engage in a way that they can influence policy decisions through channels of assemblies where they can speak to their representatives and air their views, or even young people as voters. So that's one arm for me. The other is the issue around the respect for legal framework, the respect for, I'll just put it generally, respect for rule of law. So the continent is one continent that is blessed with very beautiful instruments. Think around the African Charter on Democracy, democracy, elections, and governance. Within the ECOWAS region, we have the ECOWAS Protocol. A lot of these instruments commits member states to upholding the principles of democracy and rule of law, talks about regular, transparent, free, fair elections, and also the need for government to promote popular participation, equality at all levels. So if you think around just the instruments that guide how member states engage within the continent, and the national laws, if you read a lot about constitutions in Africa, beautifully written. I was reading the constitution of Niger and Gabon when the coup happened. And in my mind, if these constitutions were upheld, you wouldn't have the number of citizens that were celebrating the military takeover. Because there's one thing to have a military takeover, there's another thing to have popular support for that. There's a difference when citizens are protesting the unconstitutional change of government, but it's different where you have a larger population really celebrating the unconstitutional change. So it means that fundamentally there are root causes that have not been addressed, which is what brings me to how member states, how leaders commit to their to the responsibilities or the principles of democracies and rule of law as expounded in our instruments and our local laws. And for the average young person who watch these leaders, a lot of them see the level of impunity at the point of leadership, or level of leadership, as something as a major turnoff in how they will engage the system. So for them, why should I care about democracy? Why should I participate when my leaders do not even respect the rules? They don't care about the constitution. They don't care about the charters and the protocols. So why should I care about participating? Will my participation yield results? Will it change the system? And so if you put that within the conversation, I do believe that one of the things that can be done to engage young people to get to even inspire trust in democracy again is to start seeing strict compliance to the rule of law in respective countries in Africa. And I'll give a simple example, the Gabon elections. A lot of us observed that election. And when the coup happened, most people were not really surprised because that was a system that fundamentally there is regular elections, but it was not necessarily producing, it was not a transparent process that was producing the outcome that citizens did believe was their choice. And so when you have a system that has been held onto, has been closed for so long, where you have what some of us call the constitutional coup d'etat. So you have presidents who look for ways to manipulate the constitution or extend term limits, change constitutions to enable their long stay in government, close opportunities for oppositions to compete and contest during elections, shut down freedom of expression, or even shut down any form of dissent. When all of these factors are persistent in a particular system, it creates a sense of hopelessness amongst the populace, and in this case for Africa, amongst the young people, because for them, what they are viewing is the system as it is would not accept my dissent or my opposition. The system as it is would not accept my ability to question or demand accountability. The system as it is would not even care if I exist or not. And so for a lot of young people, it's not necessarily about the verbal conversation around democracy is here to stay in Africa or where constitutional democracy is about the actions of the leaders and how well they are upholding these principles and values of democracy and even respecting the rule of law. So this is the other part for me on engagement. Young people, these days, for them, it's, yeah, I engaged before, it did not yield any results, so why should I engage? So if we solve the problem of opening up the space, then we need to address the issue of complying to the rules, having leaders respect these principles, and having some level of accountability at the point of leadership. And I bring the conversation around accountability because it's one thing to have member states sign up to instruments and have beautiful constitution. It's another thing for the respective leaders at that, be it at the ECOWAS level, at the African Union level, or at the SADC level, whatever level, right? For leaders within that system to hold each other accountable. So I was on a panel post the Niger and Gabon coup, and some young persons asked that when there was extension of term limits, none of the other presidents called for actions to be taken. And to them, that was undemocratic. And so there was no question, there was no accountability. They talked about when, for Gabon, there was a shutdown of the internet during the elections. Voters could not even express themselves. And no one was called to order. No president within the continent called anyone to order. And when there were issues raised in Niger, the question was, the ECOWAS, the leaders within ECOWAS did not even reach out to their counterpart in Niger. You also have this conversation going on in Togo. There is a conversation going on in Cameroon, because as we have these conversations, younger people are watching, and now there is a military takeover playbook. It may not be widely circulated, but people are watching, and you constantly, if you go on social media, you hear people calling for the military to take over, even in Nigeria, which ordinarily you wouldn't expect, because we just had a long history of military dictatorship. We fought for a democracy that we supposedly ought to be celebrating. But you go to some corners, you hear young people saying, I wish what happened in Niger would happen in Nigeria. And you begin to wonder, why do you think that is an option or that is a solution? But it raises the fundamental question that the values have been abused, and the values of democracies have been abused. They've been high levels of impunity, lack of accountability at different levels. And for younger people, they do believe that for them, what is the alternative? And I think how to better engage, honestly, comply to the rules, uphold the rule of law, and start holding accountability at all levels. So at the regional level, sub-regional level, and also accountability at the national level. And the third and the last point, and for me, because he talked about the results collation and how that also impacts on acceptance of results. And I always say that in election, perception is everything. And where there is a perception that the process is not credible, regardless of how many press statements are issued to prove that the process is credible, there would always be questions. And so if I take the Nigerian example, the Nigerian elections as just one major example, if you read the reports, these elections were not the worst elections we had in Nigeria. If you read the reports from 2019, one major thing was that we did not have any substantial improvement from the 2019 elections. And pre the elections, there was a lot of hope. And the Electoral Commission built so much expectation. And there were lots of promises that this process with technology, there will be better transparency, and that voters can follow through the collation, can follow through the results, and would have access to the results. And so when you build so much hope and expectations in the process, you have citizens support the Electoral Commission pre the elections, in the demand for a review to the law to enable the Electoral Commission to deploy technology. That was one particular provision that had young people excited, technology. And so you've built that hope and expectation. There is a new law, there is a guideline that expounds on how the process would be. However, when it came to the implementation, considering that in a lot of elections in Africa, the results collation process is still the weakest link. And so a lot of voters do believe that if they trust the collation process, then they can trust the outcome. And for them, transparency in the collation process is the only factor that would enable their trust in the system. And how do you get transparency is that we can follow through, which was why the upload of results on the result viewing portal in the 2023 election became a fundamental factor. So regardless of some of the positives in the elections, the fact that the Electoral Commission had challenges uploading the results for the presidential election, which is the most, that's the election that everyone is focusing on. The fact that the commission failed or had challenges uploading the results on the result viewing portal created a perception that the process was flawed, that the process was not credible. It was not necessarily about the logistics challenges. There were major logistics challenges, but if you follow the conversation, it seemed that that issue of result viewing portal became a major conversation. And regardless of what the outcome is, regardless of the data showing that the Tinubu would have still did receive the larger number of votes, regardless of all of that, for the average voter, you promised us we'll view the result on elections day. We did not see the results on the portal. Other results for other elections were uploaded, and you've not engaged us to explain why that failed. And so if I bring this down to the process of collation, how that is, how can that process be enhanced? I do believe that when it comes to results collation in respective countries, that elections management body must invest, one, in ensuring that whatever process or method of or mode of results collation that is adopted is a process that they themselves can guarantee its utility, its functionality, and its ability to collate the results properly. So you don't develop or design a process that you are not fully capable of managing and administering. That's one. Meaning that there is nothing wrong for electoral commissions to say, we do not have the capacity to do this and that. We want to focus on this. And this is what we can achieve. And this is how we can achieve that. So making rules that are realistic and designing modes of collation that are realistic and that are easily managed. The second is the principle of transparency. When it comes to results collation, what is not seen and known would never be believed. And so for results collation in respective countries in Africa, and I think well, not just in Africa, a lot of voters and citizens, all they want to believe is that my vote was translated to what informed the outcome of the elections, meaning that the processes for collation must be open, must be transparent, and access to information on the process must be made available for voters and political parties and stakeholders. The third is compliance to the rules. Once rules are designed for the elections, the moment an electoral commission steps aside a part of the rule without reasonable justification, it raises fundamental questions. And what we saw in the elections was INEC, for Nigerian situation, for instance, had given a guideline, and then at the point of results collation, decided to step aside one part of it because of the technological glitch, as they said. But there was no communication, there was no statement, or even just an addendum. I'm a lawyer. We always say for every general rule, there's an exception, meaning that as you implement, the moment you observe there's a problem, there is something that stops you from saying, we can't comply with this. This is an addendum or an amendment to this particular rule, and this will be the rule for these elections, and we'll apply this now. And the moment the commission failed to comply with a part of this rule, not all parts, because the challenge was the part on upload, the moment the commission failed to comply with that, it became a major challenge. And so one of the things I'm learning from Nigeria from Sierra Leone, if you follow the elections in Zimbabwe and even Kenya, is that once rules are made, once the law is clear, uniformity of practice and overall compliance to the rule is important in inspiring trust in the final outcome of the elections. And the last and final point for me is the role of the political actors. Because it's one thing to have the Electoral Commission to engage the process and do its bit. There's also something about the rhetoric from the political actors. We know that there is some level of political, what I'll call political shenanigans when it comes to politicians within our respective countries. And once a party feels they are losing out, they take advantage of the media space, take advantage of their supporters, and start to create a lot of diversion from the process, creating a lot of confusion. And a lot of times you have parties making assertions without evidence, without any claims. So it's just pushed for them to create the distrust first, and we can address it later. And I do believe that our elections can only get better when we have political parties that are built and designed in lines with ideology. I think Mr. Board mentioned this earlier. What we currently have are political parties that do not see themselves as important institutions in a democracy. So they engage the process from a transactional point of view rather than building democracy, which is why a lot of political parties focus on just contesting elections, and after elections, you do not hear from them, which is why you see politicians crossing from one party to the other. Because there are no ideologies, the institutions are not built as political institutions that support democracy. And so they do not see themselves as major stakeholders in ensuring democratic development, which is why it's easier for politicians to deploy thugs, to create confusion during elections, to buy voters or buy votes, to induce the system, to bribe and corrupt people, and to just carry on with some level of impunity. And so the last point for me when it comes to results collation and generally around engagement in democracy is that we need to, for major changes to happen, we need to invest in building political parties that are true institutions of democracy, parties that are built or developed or structured in lines with ideologies, and parties that understand that they are key players in the system in a way that can ensure some level of development in our democracy, rather than engaging from a point of transaction. Because at the end of it all, the Electoral Commission can do its work, the judiciary may do its work, but if politicians are not willing to play by the game, all the efforts will yield no results, because the political parties are still powerful players, and we need them to review how they engage the system and the process. I'll stop here for now.
Thank you, Cynthia, for that in-depth response. There's just so much to unpack. And I know that there are scholars on this call who, all the insights that I shared so far, open up, a room for furthering research and interrogation on the different research pieces that they're working on. So I hear that, I hear you saying that young people are definitely increasingly becoming politically and more socially aware, and that they want to participate. But there's a huge disillusionment with the process, with the increasing reversals that we're seeing in the democratic process. But even more, the lack of trust in the political and electoral process, and the abandoning of the rule of law that we see at different levels, national, sub-regional, and regional. So, we're hoping, your recommendations are that the process has to be transparent, a more involved political party system, and compliance to the rule of law. You also mentioned in some of your responses, you talked about the role of social media and the use of that space. And that would take me to my question to Dr. Siegle on, I think all the panelists at different responses mentioned technology in their submissions. And it takes us to this very important question around technology. So technology is rapidly evolving and influencing election processes globally, but it also raises concerns about cybersecurity and the potential for manipulation. What are your views on this issue, and what model institutional safeguards are needed to protect the integrity of electronic voting systems and democracy?
Yeah, thanks, Ada. Yeah, it's a huge question, and one that's rapidly evolving, really by the day and by the election. So we're on a very steep learning curve on this. So I'm just going to try to summarize a few of the highlights that I'm watching. Let's start with recognizing some of the advantages that digital technologies are providing to elections. We've mentioned some of these already, but the first is that digital technology is helping to increase transparency for the voter rolls and the accreditation processes. We saw this in Nigeria with the BVAS, the bimodal voters accreditation system, and it did succeed in thinning out some of the bloated voter rolls, ghost voters, double counting of voters, allowed for independent and transparent oversight of those lists. I think that's a plus. Theoretically, on election day, digital technology should allow for verifiable voter IDs, the transparent and efficient uploading of votes into the system, which can then be directly transmitted to a central location for collation. So you have both transparency at the local level and nationally. And the idea is that this bypasses all the many intermediary steps that you would otherwise pass through with a hand counting system, and which leaves the system open to manipulation. And from a election integrity standpoint, it contributes to a more clean forensic record if you need to do investigations. Another advantage is that it allows for real-time election monitoring. And we saw this most successfully, I think, in Kenya, where even though it was a very closely contested election, because the real-time votes were being tabulated and citizens could see it was neck and neck and could see where the votes were being tabulated from, it added credibility to the final result. And I think it just raises the visibility and reduces concerns that these votes are being manipulated along the way. The last advantage I would draw attention to is with regards to fact checking. And digital technology is really helping to increase the scale and speed with which fact checking can take place. This is helping fact checking keep up with the uses of digital technology for bots and other amplification methods that help fact checkers stay on top of fraudulent claims in real time. It really speeds up the transcription process, allows for search and alert mechanisms, and calling out falsehoods more rapidly. We saw this both in Nigeria and in Kenya. In Kenya, there was the Full Fact initiative that was partly sponsored by Google, and it allowed for interoperable cooperation among fact checkers. And they found that with this new system, they were able to go from 100 inquiries where they were fact checking a day up to 100,000. They were able to weed through. So really important advantages and powerful strengths in terms of what digital technology can bring. Same time, some really important disadvantages. When you rely on technology for an election, then you're beholden to that technology if it doesn't work on election day. And we saw this in Nigeria. And I think there was a gross underestimation of how much work is required, how much time is required to authenticate voters across 176,000 polling sites. I think it really pointed to the need for technical support and the need for training, both within election management bodies, but also in terms of, IT people to help troubleshoot when things go down or the system's not functioning at the local level, nationally, much more so than what we saw with traditional hand counting mechanisms. I think, with regards to oversight, while technology is supposed to help with improving transparency, we need to recognize that it also provides openings for manipulation. And so if you can have technological manipulation of results, it's a more efficient way of stealing elections. And so there has to be really stronger cybersecurity protections against that, and to realize that even though you have technology, there's still a human hand. And as Dave alluded to in his opening remarks, there's dubious scenarios where some votes are being forwarded and others aren't. Or in Nigeria, we saw cases where election workers were forgetting their passwords. And so this was preventing them from uploading results. And so there needs to be safeguarding of this and backstopping of how do you respond when the system isn't working or when there are evident breakdowns in what's going on with the with the digital technology. I would say a few words about hacking. This is a quickly emerging field. It's very murky, and so we don't have clear evidence, but it is a growing and I think a real concern. There was an expose the past year of an Israeli cyber mercenary firm that has claimed to have been contracted to work on some 33 different presidential elections around the world, including in Kenya. And their services include disinformation, impersonation, hacking, forging, blackmail, planning false intelligence. There's all sorts of things that can be done, potentially using cyber tools, that I don't think we are prepared for. And as the Israeli cyber mercenary firm case shows, they intentionally try to stay in the background. They want to seem like this is all normal. There's nothing going on. But some of the early research on this shows that there are at least 63 of these cyber mercenary groups that have been identified around the world. And so I think it's going to be a more direct concern that we need to plan for in African elections. And the last point I would make is with regards to disinformation. This is probably the most common way that digital technologies are being used to undercut electoral processes on the continent. The goals of disinformation around elections are not only to promote a positive image of a candidate, which in itself is really just another form of campaigning. I think the problem is when disinformation gets into promoting falsehoods, and this often involves disseminating false information about a rival. And while again, that isn't new, it's the scale and speed and the asymmetry with which it can happen. So at low cost, an individual or influencer can put out a lot of negative information that's hard to trace back to the original source. And this is changing the electoral environment around elections. The increasing availability of deep fakes and ease of doing that is also spreading confusion about who is saying what out there. And I think that's the second goal of disinformation, is just to create confusion. And if voters don't know what's going on, then they become disillusioned, may become apathetic. And so it contributes to this issue of distrust that we've been talking about. There was an incident in Kenya where there was a story around in one district in Mount Kenya, a very competitive district, where there was a false story about a leopard that was on the loose threatening people who were going to vote. And so this suppressed voter turnout in that area. And so, and then I would finally just talk about how social media algorithms tend to accentuate polarizing claims that are out there. And this leads to more antagonism and less trust around elections. Again, fear-mongering is not a new thing, and it's manipulated by different candidates, but it's the scale and the ease and the reach that it's having with digital technologies that I think is changing the electoral landscape. And while most of this disinformation is happening at the domestic level, it does leave the door open for external influence, often in support of a particular candidate or party that is seen as more receptive to some foreign actor. But it indeed is another means by which voter enfranchisement can be lost, and ultimately sovereignty from elections can be stolen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for highlighting the advantages and disadvantages of technology, and also giving us some insights into the hacking as an issue and a possible threat, but also the more pertinent threats with regards to disinformation and misinformation and how they affect even just voter turnout, for instance. We are definitely out of time, and I think I have two questions that were emailed to me, and I have one. Oh, okay, it's not a question, it's a comment. Thanks, Vicky. That's the director of the center. I will invite our panelists to share in a few words a key takeaway or piece of advice for African nations striving to improve their elections process and strengthen their democracy. So in very few words, we can start with Cynthia and Board and Dave, and then back to Joe, and then I would end the session.
Can you hear me, please?
Yes.
Okay. Said in few words. I do believe one, strengthen the legal framework for elections in such a way that the legal framework in itself would, or rather, abides and respects the principles of transparency, inclusion, equality, and even fairness of the process. So the legal framework is key. And the second is to invest in building independent and neutral electoral commissions. Electoral commissions in itself, their composition, the institution itself must be independent and neutral, and must be seen to be independent and neutral by the people. And the third part is to always invest in opportunities to enable citizens' participation, especially youth participation in the process. Thank you.
Board.
Okay, all right. Sorry, I wasn't sure if I was next in line. All right, thanks so much, Ada, and to all the panelists for the ideas that has come through. I believe, yes, we do have challenges, but also it's not all doom and gloom. I think we must say that, for current electoral, experience with electoral democracy in Africa, sometimes we don't talk enough also about those good examples, and we must create, a community, whereby people can talk amongst themselves in terms of what is working and what is not working, just as we are taking our time to discuss in this context. Electoral reform, I agree with Cynthia, needs to continue. Good can come out of election petitions also, because we've seen that in places like South Africa and even Nigeria, that election petition has resulted in changes, in amendment to the constitution that has further strengthened the practice of electoral democracy. So I would want to say that we shouldn't give up in terms of the challenges that we're facing currently in our different countries, including, I believe I'm still young, the young ones, okay? For those of us who lived through the military era, you don't want to compare. Of course, that is not an excuse for unconstitutional, manipulation of constitutions and so on and so forth. But democracy is slow. It takes a lot of effort. There are twists and turns, but as long as we keep moving and holding those who are responsible to deliver, to be accountable to the mandates that they've been given, we keep pushing at the issues of electoral reform. I believe our democracy will mature. Cynthia, you did say it's a young democracy we have in Africa. So thanks again.
Thank you, Bod. Dave, and then Joseph.
Yeah, well, I think I would just reinforce what Bod had to say. I think for Africa's elections to improve, it's going to take political will. And that's not just from the leadership. I mean, the politicians, have to be willing to play by the rules and respect the results. But I think that African citizens also, have to demand that from their leadership. And, the citizen movements and civil society organizations that are out there, working to demand that accountability. And I think that's just going to be very important, of course, to see improvement. And I think that there has been progress, like Bod says. I think it's not all despair at this stage, despite some real concerns that we have. If you take a longer view, there's still a lot of support for elections in Africa. There have been some good elections, and I think that there have been a lot of developments in election processes, a lot of lessons that have been learned. And, I think there's every possibility that things are going to get better.
And Joe?
Thank you, Ada. I would throw out a need to try and create a mechanism for electoral appeals. And Bodunrin had talked about this, about strengthening the judiciary earlier. And I think because of the lowering bar of electoral standards we're seeing in Africa, and the fact that often the judiciaries are biased, it's not universally that way. To restore integrity in elections, there needs to be a mechanism by which citizens can appeal to an independent body for election oversight in a timely manner. And this may be at the national level. Again, it would have to be set up so that it is independent and respected, and where irregularities were vetted in a transparent way, and really concerns could be worked out, and if necessary, elections redone. I think that would do a lot to restoring credibility. If it's not possible at the national level, I see this as a regional institution. And maybe that's something that is built into the African Court on People and Human Rights, or maybe it's a separate mechanism. But it would have to be done in a timely manner. but there needs to be another layer of accountability for African elections, because I just feel like as some incumbents are able to slide by with just minimal gestures towards some electoral process, and they continue in power, we're going to see there's more incentives to see more of that. And so I think there needs to be more teeth in the regulatory aspect of elections in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. A big thank you to my panelists. We can go on and talk for 24 hours. We'll only still be scratching the surface on this issue. Thank you to the African Studies Center team, led by Dr. Vicky Rovine, the director of the center, Laura Cox, and Bolomonde Yapo. Thank you for joining us. We do have our final session next weekend, and remember that a recording would be on our YouTube channel. I will be sending the link out, and you can circulate it with your network as well. I hope you all have a good evening. Cynthia, I know you're going straight to bed. And no, we still have we still have work to do. So most of us on this other side of the world will go back to work. And enjoy your evening, Cynthia. And thank you, Dave. Thank you, Joseph. And thank you, Bodunrin. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Ada.
Thank you. Thank you, Ada. Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Bye.